Bueno, buenas tardes para todas y todos. Espero estén bien a pesar de las difíciles circunstancias que nos rodean en este momento. Yo soy Virginie Laurent, profesora del Departamento de Ciencia Política, coordinadora de los seminarios de política, y pues hoy contamos con una charla de Tiffany Shakespeare sobre nuevos enfoques del activismo, replanteamiento del debate sobre la migración en Europa. Tiffany es antropóloga, analista de políticas y activista con experiencia en migración, postcolonialismo y cuestiones relacionadas con la intersección entre justicia social y artes. Tiene un pregrado del University College London, en el marco del cual estuvo un año de visita en Sciences Po en París, y cuenta con una maestría en justicia penal de la Universidad de Oxford. Tiffany igualmente participa en la International Detention Coalition contra la detención de inmigrantes y para promover buenas prácticas y enfoques regionales de los derechos humanos desde el sur global hacia las esferas de políticas internacionales, programa en el marco del cual ha llevado a cabo investigaciones cualitativas en África y Medio Oriente. Actualmente, Tiffany es investigadora del International Center for Policy Advocacy en Berlín. So, Tiffany, good afternoon. Thank you for being with us today. I think you can have around 40 minutes for your talk, new approaches to activism, reframing the migration debate in Europe, and then we will take some questions or comments from the audience. So, Tiffany, thank you, and please.
Brilliant, thank you so much. And thank everyone for coming, especially in this difficult time, and we are in solidarity with you all. And also thanks for listening in English. I'm learning Spanish, so hopefully soon we can have these conversations in Español también. So let me share my screen. So welcome. Today we'll be talking about new approaches to activism, reframing the migration debate in Europe. And reframing in the sense, I don't know the literal translation, but it's kind of talking about marcos conceptuales. And first I will give you a little background about me and my activism, in case some of you are kind of political students who are involved in activism. And I'm going to use this metaphor of a flowing river to kind of represent my movement over the last 7 years through different roles in this ecosystem of progressive change. And maybe this will resonate with some of you who are kind of considering your activism and where you're focusing your attention. And what I did is I started downstream. So I started as a caseworker. I was helping lawyers with asylum cases. So this was very much day-to-day work, helping individual people. And then I decided, okay, I want to move upstream. I want to move into legal and policy change, because I wanted to understand the systems that were creating these problems downstream and intervene at this more structural level. And so maybe this would limit or eliminate these problems downstream. So I worked for about 4 years in Africa and the Middle East and Europe in border and migration policy and law. And here, advocating for change, decision makers really weren't listening to what we wanted, and often they didn't care about the evidence and the research, but about pleasing their voter population. So at this point, I went further upstream to back into academia. I wanted to kind of take a step back and ask these big questions. And here I got very involved in or interested in public attitudes work. So how people think about things. And this, because of course, this was one of the things that was limiting the effectiveness of our legal and policy advocacy. And actually, of course, public attitudes work is relevant to all of these levels, because they often determine how people think in all of these spaces. So where I'm doing public attitudes work at the moment is the International Center for Policy Advocacy based in Berlin, in Germany. And we are capacity builders who provide training and resources to expand advocacy and participation in promoting democratic principles and open society values. And it's important to note we have this midwife or patara role. So we're not campaigners and we're not contractors, and we rather give knowledge, we advise, we train. But in the end, it's always your baby. It's always the baby of the NGO who we're working with. And what we do is we combine two pillars. So we have policy advocacy, so speaking to decision makers, and public advocacy, speaking to the public. And this is because our underlying rationale is the public debate sets the boundaries of acceptable policy choices. And actually, ICPA started on this policy advocacy side, but over the last 10 years, they've been working on divisive issues such as migration and civic space. And they can see that the public debate has shifted, and populist narratives have been mainstreamed, and decision makers no longer are open to progressive proposals. So now we're trying to simultaneously build the public will for the progressive change that we are advocating for in policy. And in this policy advocacy space, in this public advocacy space, what we do is narrative change. And this is kind of an activist approach that is gaining momentum globally. And just a quick note on the point of intervention of narrative change work. And points of intervention are specific places in a system that activists can target to affect change. And activists have traditionally intervened at physical points, for example, the point of production or the point of consumption, so maybe boycotting, buying goods from a certain organization or corporation, or the point of decision, so maybe this is in policy forums. But narrative change is an example of intervention at a conceptual point. So it's at a point of assumption. So here what we're doing is we're trying to go upstream and intervene at the level of people's intuitions and deep core beliefs and values and worldviews. And we want to challenge these underlying assumptions. And of course, we hope that this will in turn enforce material change more downstream. And so what I'm going to do over the next 25 minutes or so is give you a little insight from Europe. I'm going to go through what the challenge is, why it is a challenge, and what can we do about it. And of course, this is contextual to Europe, but I think these themes are present everywhere. And maybe over this talk, you can think about maybe how it's relevant to Colombian context, and we can talk about it after. And if you're going to take three main things away from this presentation, mainly for you kind of more activist political students, I want you to know your audience, focus on values, and reframe and lead the debate. Okay, so part one, we are going to look at what is the challenge, and I'm going to talk you through two challenges. The first one is this mainstreaming of populist narratives. So the public debate on migration in Europe, there's a lot of polarization. But the real danger here is when we see centrists, people in the middle, using the narratives of the far right. And with this mainstreaming, populists are setting the agenda, and progressives or NGOs, activists, are stuck in countering these negative narratives. And this is problematic because, as I said, the public debate sets the boundaries of acceptable policy choices. And policy on migration, as we're seeing in the EU, is not so much shaped by research and evidence and values of diversity and inclusion, but moving towards this kind of being shaped by public narratives of fear and exclusion. And of course, the technical term for this rationale is the Overton window, which is about the range of ideas that the public is willing to consider or accept. And what we're seeing in the EU is in some contexts, quite extreme ideas about security and policing and prisons, desired by the far right, but fringe ideas have entered or coming closer to entering this window and being seen as common sense. So that was the first challenge, this mainstreaming of populism. And the second one is about NGO or progressive responses. And as I said, we are not only getting stuck in reacting to populist arguments, but traditional progressive approaches, including kind of shouting about rights, so citing legal commitments to international human rights law, or shouting about facts, or like, for example, confirming the economic benefits of migration. Many of these arguments are not resonating with a lot of the public. And there's this attitude of us progressives kind of, oh, if only they knew the facts. But often what we say is not heard, and instead we are shutting down conversations. And with this kind of facts and rights-based lecturing, we are met with angry and defensive responses. And sometimes we're even pushing people's views slightly further to the right. And before I explain what we can do better as progressives, I want to go into part 2 and give you a little bit of theory. So why is this a challenge? And so many disciplines, especially cognitive science and linguistics and social psychology, there's a consensus that people are moved and change their minds through emotional stimuli, so relating to personal and lived experience, not rational stimuli. And this is because we understand the world less through this kind of reasoned deliberation of facts, and more through kind of the metaphors and stories that enable us to make sense of the information that we receive. And this is due to this confirmation bias that people believe and remember facts selectively based on this previously held understanding of a subject. And so where does this understanding come from? So this is about frames. People are frame-driven, not fact-driven. And frames are incredibly important. Frames are stories we use to make sense of the complex world. And they become socialized in our communities. They've become part of our identities. They've become part of our common sense. And this core attachment to these frames means they can easily be triggered by a single word, a single picture, a single metaphor. And this triggers an entire full picture or full story on the nature of the problem, the causes of the problem, who's to blame, the good guys, the bad guys, and the kind of possible solutions that follow. And often these frames, we might be so embedded in these frames, it's kind of like the water, the fish swim in. We don't even realize that we are seeing the world through them. And frames are incredibly powerful. They become so established, they're very, very easily triggered. And this is kind of activating the cognitive unconscious, so the vast, intricate work performed silently by these millions of circuits in the brain. And a brilliant phrase for this is cultural acupuntura. So it's kind of like literally inserting a pin into the nervous system. So the takeaway here is it's not what you say, but it's what you trigger. And just an example from Europe. A few years ago, David Cameron, the former Conservative Prime Minister of the UK, when asked about the Calais refugee camp, and the Calais refugee camp is in France. There's a lot of people trying to claim asylum coming from Africa and the Middle East. A few people are based in Calais. And when asked about it, he spoke of a swarm or an enjambre of people. And so what does this word trigger in you? How does it make you feel? What images are conjured in your mind? For a lot of people, you kind of think, okay, he's talking about threat, animals, invasion. It kind of triggers this maybe almost biblical image of a swarm of locusts. And so here you can see he's kind of naming the problem. He's triggering our thoughts about the nature of the problem. Like people as animals, it's a threat. There's a mass of people, it's unmanageable. And what are the logical solutions that flow from this? I mean, he's implying we should build walls, kind of, have law and order politics. And Just an example closer to home, the Ministry of Defense a couple of months ago was talking about the FARC bombing, was in Guaviare, and talked about children as machines of war. So here again, we're seeing this dehumanization. People are seen as machines, it's kind of threat, there's fear narrative, there's no trust, there's kind of fatalistic idea of what's going to happen. And the logical solution that might follow is at least locking them up, maybe extermination. So you can see here that these dehumanizing metaphors, they're kind of triggering stories about the nature of the problem and these kind of logical solutions that might follow. So to sum up so far and end this kind of second part of the talk, conservatives are very good at framing. They're good at using stories and appealing to emotions, using political rhetoric that kind of touches people's emotions, that triggers stories and solutions. And NGOs and progressives are not so good, like with their kind of approaches of using rights and facts sometimes. As Lakoff, who is a cognitive linguistic philosopher, he says, well, frames win over facts. Their frames will stay and facts will bounce off. And of course, progressives, we're seeing they're not resonating with a lot of the public. They're making people feel defensive and sometimes pushing them further to the right. And all of this has the effect of mainstreaming populist narratives and the subsequent closing of the policy space for more progressive change. So moving on to part 3, and what can we do about it? And first I'm going to introduce you to the campaign that we created, that we kind of incubated in our Narrative Change Lab, which ran in Germany between 2017 to 2019. And this was a product of a long-term campaign planning process to promote diversity and counter Islamophobia or anti-Muslim racism. And it was run by Juma, which is a network of German people and NGOs with a Muslim background. And so these people were really suffering from this change of public narrative that was very anti-migrant, and there was an increase of Islamophobia. And what they did is created a new narrative showing kind of normal daily life of German Muslim protagonists. And we created posters, we created videos, put them online. And I'm going to show you a 2-minute video now, which is one of the videos that was created. So let me know if the audio doesn't work.
Mein Name ist Sally, ich bin 21 Jahre alt und Medizinstudentin und Doktorandin an der Charité in Berlin. Als meine Mutter herkam, hatte sie niemals den Glauben, dass ich sowas wie Abitur machen könnte, weil sie gemerkt hat, das ist ein fremdes Land und ich weiß nicht, wie alles funktioniert und vielleicht schafft das mein Kind nicht. Und dann habe ich mich hingesetzt, nachdem ich meine Abi-Note hatte und dachte mir so, okay, krass, also du könntest eigentlich Medizin studieren. So. Und dann habe ich mich dafür beworben, kam rein und war die beste Entscheidung meines Lebens. Also was mir am Medizinstudium gefällt, ist die Medizin an sich. Also ich bin sehr so ein wissenschaftlicher Typ und ich stehe drauf, allein zu verstehen, wie krass unser menschlicher Körper aufgebaut ist. Und ich finde das halt auch faszinierend, dass du dir Wissen aneignen kannst, mit dem du bestimmtes Leiden von Menschen beenden kannst.
Ich habe Sally vor circa 1,5 oder 2 Jahren kennengelernt. Sally ist ein sehr aufgeschlossener Mensch. Sie ist ein hilfsbereiter Mensch, ein netter Mensch. Ich kann eigentlich nur Positives äußern.
Also in der Medizin spielt Teamarbeit auf jeden Fall eine Rolle, weil du bist als Arzt nicht alleine da. Du brauchst immer Unterstützung von anderen Fachkräften. Und da ist es wirklich wichtig, dass du lernst, in einem Team interdisziplinär an einem Patienten arbeiten zu können. Muss ja sein, weil Medizinstudium ist ja nicht so einfach und sehr fordernd. Und ich gehe gerne zum Rudern, weil du bist dann umgeben vom Wasser, von Tieren, von Pflanzen und das ist halt einfach eine ganz andere Umgebung als im Alltag.
Teamarbeit beim Rudern ist alles. Wenn man in einem Doppelzweier sitzt, also einfach in einem sehr wackeligen Boot, geht es auch viel um Vertrauen. Ich muss Sally vertrauen, dass sie das Boot nicht zum Kentern bringt und sie muss gleichzeitig mir vertrauen, dass ich das Boot nicht zum Kentern bringe. Und man rückt automatisch einfach sehr zusammen. Ich glaube, das ist so das Besondere am Rudern.
Gemeinsam menschlich bedeutet für mich, dass verschiedenste Individuen zusammen mit einer positiven Tat im Kleinen oder im Großen etwas Gutes für die Gesellschaft tun.
Okay, so now I will give you a few insights into what happened behind the scenes of this campaign. And I'm going to just focus on 3 strategies that were employed. And the first is know your audience. So to shift norms and change rules, we really need a more complicated view of the public. They are much more complex than this for versus against view of the world that activists tend to have. They think, or we think, that the public falls into 2 camps, your supporters and your opponents. But actually, no, in most countries, based on extensive polling and surveys, there's a breakdown of about 15% supporters, 15% opponents, and 70% in the middle, so people who are not quite sure or undecided about certain issues. And if we want to win the debate and push back this mainstreaming, some of us need to broaden our target audience for communication. And what we say is you should empower your base, so the green people, you should engage the middle, and you should name and marginalize your opponents. So here you have kind of one strategy that's working towards your movement goal, but with different tactics for different audiences. And yeah, the numbers are in the middle, and it's possible to change their minds. So your facts and rights arguments might appeal to your base, your supporters, but you need to reframe to get into the middle. And of course, middle work isn't for everybody, but it's important to say that understanding does not equal agreement. So we're going to go back to the segmentation of the public and knowing your audience. And importantly, this is values-based segmentation of the public. So this is based on large representative surveys. And traditionally, studies of public attitudes and of the public, they're based on demographics, for example, age, income, ethnicity, or gender, or political party affiliation. But actually, the explanatory power of these categories has decreased, and values are more predictive of political views, of political behavior. For example, household income does not necessarily tell us much about people's perception of threat or danger. And your political party affiliation might not tell us who struggles with refugee policy and who doesn't. So here we're going kind of upstream to this level of kind of underlying values and worldviews that drive these attitudes more downstream. So back to the Duma campaign, the video you watched. So which audience did they choose? Well, this is the breakdown of the German public into value-based segments. And based on this research, they needed to decide who needs to be reached and with what message, because they knew that different groups would react differently. And they chose the economic pragmatists, kind of closer to their supporter base, 20% of the German population. So these are people who maybe are worried about a loss of German identity because of migration, but they also see the benefits of migration for the economy. And what they did is they tested their message with this group to choose the most effective one. And then they put these kind of videos online, and through paid Facebook advertisements, they specifically directed them to their chosen target audience. Okay, so that was the first point. It's about knowing your audience. And of course, this campaign would have been different, very different, if they chose a different audience. And now moving on to the second part of what can we do about it is, well, let's focus on values. And this is for 2 reasons. The first is that, well, values-based messages and narratives resonate more than facts and rights, which, as we've seen, they don't necessarily work with some audiences. This is because values touch emotions. They resonate with the person's core beliefs. And knowing what to say to different audiences because we know their values might mean we're more likely to convince them or motivate them or activate them. Back to the campaign, Duma, they found the values that they believed in themselves and that they shared with their target audience from the movable middle, which was the economic pragmatists. For example, values such as community, teamwork, nature. And so you can see in the video, she kind of loves being with her teammates in the hospital or in the boat. She loves being out on the river in nature. And because we're touching on our target audience's values, or their heart, and making them feel comfortable, and then we can add what we're really trying to talk about here, which is kind of pro-diversity, anti-Islam racism. And therefore it's more accepted because she's obviously a Muslim woman, she's wearing a headscarf, and we're kind of wrapping up this diversity in a more familiar way, in values that resonate with the target audience. So focus on shared values instead of differences. And this technique of showing diversity, not discussing it, means you can try and open up a conversation to reset the agenda. And the second point on why we should focus on values, I've said it before, but just to repeat it, it's a better way of knowing our audience. Like, values are really thought to be a major guiding force of behavior. And as I said, they're more predictive of views and behavior than traditional categories. Okay, so when you've got your audience and when you've got their values in mind, then you need to reframe and lead the debate. So part 3, reframing and leading the debate. As I said, we as activists spend a lot of time countering opposition narratives. And in fact, we get stuck in the frames of our opposition. And as George Lakoff, the cognitive linguistic professor, says, if you negate a frame or argue against it, sometimes you can reinforce it. And instead, we need to lead the debate. So activists need to be proactive in setting the agenda to broaden this narrative space in the public debate. And Juma, back to the campaign, Juma, they could have easily framed their campaign as kind of stop Islamophobia, anti-Islamophobia. But no, they chose to create a new narrative, which was Together Human. And another point about frames is to know how to lead and reframe the debate. We need to take into account the existing frames of our target audiences. So we want to kind of see the water that the movable middle fish are swimming in. And based on social listening, or escucha en redes sociales, based on this kind of research that we commissioned, we created these frames maps. So this was about the migration debate in Germany. And let's just, there are 7 frames, but just let's look at the instability one, because this was the frame invoked by former Prime Minister of the UK when he talked about this swarm of migrants. So he's triggering stories about importing terrorism and a loss of state control, which leads to more security responses. And interestingly, this is the size of the frames. They're about 70% negative and 30% positive. Back to the campaign, these frames maps were very useful for Juma because they could see kind of which areas to target, which areas to avoid. They were very careful not to trigger these red frames, even by countering them in the campaign. And they could also prepare responses to some of these frames. And of course, build on these green, more positive frames. I'm sure, yeah, I mean, in the video, you can see maybe they're touching on the pragmatism frame. She's a doctor, she's contributing to the German society. Okay, so that was the third strategy about leading the debate and reframing. So to sum up, the 3 takeaways is we want to know your audience, focus on values, and reframe and lead the debate. And we have many more lessons in our toolkit that was created through this practice of the Narrative Change Lab. So I would advise, it's free, it's online, please check it out. Before I finish, I should flag the importance of evaluation of narrative change campaigns. And when we evaluated this campaign, it did shift people's attitudes. So we had, through Swayable, we did a representative sample of German target audience and had a test group who were shown the campaign and answered questions on migration, Islam, and integration, and the control group who were shown an unconnected video and asked the same questions. And we measured, well, the software measured the opinion lift, and it was a 12-point positive attitude shift, which is a lot in this line of work. So to conclude, I will go back to the river analogy, and within this kind of ecosystem of social and political change, we need people, of course, working upstream, downstream. Narrative change and reframing is a tiny little tool intervening upstream at the point of assumption. And of course, alone it doesn't do much, but must be used alongside many other kind of tactics like community organizing, policy advocacy, litigation. And of course, it also must be explicitly connected to changing the rules, changing this more kind of structural level of policy and law. Because if not, what use is it? So yes, thank you so much for listening. And I'm looking forward to comments, questions, clarifications, and maybe hearing more about the context in Colombia if anything resonates with you. Thank you
so much, Tiffany. Yes, I think we can have now some questions and comments. And anyway, I think it's very thought-provoking and a kind of message of hope we all can have in our minds now. Thank you so much. I don't know who would like to start. Miguel.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Tiffany, for your talk, and well, this is the second time I hear this talk, but I have every time a different question, and especially considering the context we are living. I think this is so important because to some extent we are stuck in this, contradicting each other's frames instead of leading a narrative. But I have a particular question on let's frame it in terms of left and right, or conservatism and a progressive agenda versus a conservative agenda, and to what extent do you think that the progressive agenda is in a structural disadvantage to set in motion this type of strategy? And let me explain, because the fact that they lead the debate using fear, to some extent, that gives them an advantage to build these frames, and on the other hand, I think they are, I don't know if that's true, being more able than progressives to lead the agenda, maybe because they are defending status quo, or or maybe because they are faster in setting up or leading the narrative of new frames, and there are two examples that to me are revealing of that possible pattern. The first one is back in 2016 when we were debating around the peace agreement. They were able to frame it in terms of this gender ideology. I'm not sure if that had an impact. And now they are being super fast talking about this molecular revolution that we are, now this is the new debate, and people are reacting to that, and as people in the progressive side react to that, they are just reinforcing the frame because they are helping the other side to disseminate this message among a wider public. So do you think that we are in a structural disadvantage, maybe because of fear or because of lack of, I don't know, training, ability, or something like that?
Thanks, Mia. That's an interesting question. And I guess I'll start with, of course, negating your opposition's framing or countering them is incredibly important, and it works in some contexts. But when we're talking about maybe targeting these kind of audiences beyond the choir, then we have to sequence it differently. And I guess a structural disadvantage. It's interesting, a lot of the literature we base this work on, I would say it's almost kind of, we're on a moral values disadvantage as well, because I think, like I said, conservatives are good at kind of triggering people's emotions. they, I don't know if any of you have come across the social psychologist Jonathan Haidt, and he has this moral foundations framework. And what he does, he says that conservatives are, there are kind of, I mean, five moral foundations: fairness, care, purity, authority, and loyalty. And progressives kind of, in their moral universe, they touch on fairness and care, and conservatives touch on all of them, but especially the kind of purity, authority, and loyalty. So it's kind of like, yeah, how do we wrap up our kind of arguments about justice, gender justice, maybe with moral values that might resonate more with the broader population? So, for example, kind of touching these kind of messages on authority, maybe family, religion, traditional values. How do we make them kind of not allow the kind of right to kind of take up all this space, and how do we use them to engage the middle? And just an example of that, in the kind of the gay rights debate in Ireland and the USA, kind of arguments on kind of equal rights, they weren't resonating with a lot of the population, so they reframed it to arguments on like family. And this really worked. They won the narrative space. So yeah, I'm wondering, it's a structural disadvantage, it's a moral values disadvantage. And yeah, it would be interesting to see in the Colombian context, these kind of attempts to maybe reframe some of this kind of progressive ideology in kind of the moral values that might resonate more with the broader population. I wonder if there has been any attempt to do that here.
Well, I don't know, and I don't think so. I don't really know, but yeah. Thank you, Tiff, for your answer. Maybe if someone wants to ask in Spanish, we can do the translation, or Tiffany. Yeah.
Si quieren hacer una pregunta o un comentario en español, yo creo que ya están habilitados los micrófonos, ¿cierto? Para que puedan ir directamente. Y en todo caso,
there's a question in the chat.
sí, es más
More,
un comentario.
Exactly. Yeah, thanks, Daniel. It's very interesting, because I guess what we're trying to do here is kind of, or the research that does values-based segmentation is trying to kind of gain the theoretical insights from these different disciplines like social psychology, behavioral economics, neuroscience, and these kind of methodically advancing explanations of political divisions and grounding it in kind of rich theoretical understandings of the human mind. So it's an interesting kind of new way to maybe look at competing ways of perceiving and experiencing the world, and how that relates to kind of polarization and division. And of course, a lot of this research actually is made in an academic space, but in an academic space with the desire to use this research for creating new solutions and new messages. And again, I mean, Miguel and I had a chat, but it's I know that you do a lot of public attitudes research in Los Andes, and I wonder if you've also been doing values-based segmentation of publics, or yeah, is there much focus on this in Colombian context?
Había, pues Daniel Alejandro levantó la mano, la volvió a bajar, pero si de pronto quieres pues, hacer un comentario directamente, será bienvenido, Daniel.
Gracias. Es que solamente, pues sí me interesaría conocer un poco más del trabajo de Tiffany, porque pues parte de lo que hemos conversado en el departamento de psicología tiene que ver con la formación o sea, cómo es que muchos factores intervienen en la formación de actitudes políticas. Entonces, hay ocasiones en las que se explican, por ejemplo, el favoritismo hace cierto postulado a partir de una respuesta emocional o de una respuesta cognitiva. Esta postura de los marcos que me estás planteando me parece muy interesante y me gustaría precisamente conocer un poco más de tu trabajo. De pronto, no sé si podemos cambiar correos para conversar un poco más adelante.
You want me to translate, Tiffany?
Por favor.
Okay, yeah, Daniel wants to know more about your work on this area because he's doing research in the psychology department, more in a cognitive psychology approach, and he's very interested in this frames approach that you are presenting. So he would like to know more about frames and the work you have done, and if it's possible, I saw you put your email in the last slide, but probably if you put it in the chat, he can contact you in the future.
Let me put it in now. Thank you, Daniel. It's fascinating. I'd love to hear more about your research. And actually, so maybe I should reiterate. So we in ICPA don't do this research ourselves. We commission it, or we kind of use the research of organizations in Europe who are doing this at the moment. Actually, there's an organization called More in Common, and they have offices in the US and around Europe. So they're doing a lot of this research. So yeah, let's chat. I would love to tell you more about the kind of research process. I can tell you about this core beliefs methodology, and also the other kind of benefits of using this to go upstream, look at people's values to maybe see how they're predicting people's attitudes or people's political behavior. Thank you. Yeah, it's cluster analysis for people with the good quantitative minds here. It's kind of cluster analysis created through a k-means solution process. So yeah, I can tell you more about that.
And maybe if you could tell a little bit more about what you're doing, and I would like to know more about what you're doing now in Colombia.
Of course. What we're doing with ICPA at the moment, so we have the Narrative Change Lab. It was a pilot, and we're trying to, so this evaluation to show that this kind of reframing, this narrative change and targeting the movable middle methodology, it works in Germany. There's a lot of data that says it works in like the Anglo-American sphere, but now we can say, hey, this works in Germany. So what we're doing now is we're thinking about this question of scale. I mean, what can one campaign really do? I mean, not much. It's very small scale. So we're trying to kind of lift up this work. So what we're doing is attaching this methodology to kind of working at scale through kind of a movement smart network perspective. So we're trying to expand the work and create allies around Europe, around the world. And what we're trying to do as well is now we are creating an incubator. So we're calling it the Strategic Communications Incubator. And so what it is doing is kind of offers different entry points for organizations to come and say, hey, we just need a few building blocks of kind of narrative, how to do narrative change and strategic communications. And other organizations can come in and we can fully incubate the process with the idea that this strategic communications narrative change approach will be institutionalized within their organization. So at the moment, we're working with a coalition in Germany called Claim Alliance, which is, again, it's fighting Islamophobia. And we're at the beginning of this. So right now we're going through the process of kind of enabling them to choose their audiences. We've done more values-based segmentation of audiences, specifically around the issue of Islamophobia and of migration and integration. And so I can, yeah, if you follow us, you can see some updates about that. And we're trying to also create a theory of change because, of course, we're trying to create a theory of change linking this kind of narrative change, new narratives, the presence of new narratives in the public debate to the power level, to the kind of policy and structural change. So we're trying to look at this kind of more intermediate level of immersion, like how are these narratives socialized in communities? How are people kind of using these narratives to paint their own world with them, not just being kind of told about them, but being like really living in them, embodying them. So we're looking into kind of social contact theory and how you can kind of embed this narrative change approach to maybe more like service provision and community engagement. So again, I can talk to you more about that in more detail if you send me an email or follow the organization. And Colombia, I'm here. I've moved here, so I'm working as a researcher for ICP in Berlin, but I'm also just establishing life here as well, learning Spanish, and hopefully we'll be able to do some kind of this work here as well, eventually.
Thank you. Well, I don't know if someone else would like to ask or comment something else. ¿Alguien más que quiera de pronto hacer un comentario o una pregunta? Maybe I just would like to stress something you already said. I was thinking about Cameron's reference to swarm, and and of course some of the comments in the last days about well, I don't know the exact word in English, but I think it's exactly the same sense of hordas. Well, this kind of swarm about indigenous people of the Minga, and I was very impressed by the reference to this kind of swarm by Uribe, and at the same time it was also the same word that was employed by the right-wing groups in Bolivia 2 years ago after Evo story, and in France too. In the last days, there was a letter from military officers who were referring to a danger for France, kind of civil war threat, and because of migrants and so on. And I think it's something very, very interesting to see that all around the world we can have this kind of processes, and that's why I think it can be very, very stimulating to think about another way to approach, to reframe such kind of narrative. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, these awful kind of established frames that are being deployed around the world. Yeah, these dehumanizing metaphors that, yeah, we have to figure out how to dismantle them in not just the traditional way, but think about more creative ways, targeting different audiences. And yeah, this is one way, one tiny way, but we're trying. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think I only have to thank you again and dar las gracias a todos y todas por estar con nosotros. Y creo que ya pues sería pues desearles una feliz tarde para todos, todas, y ánimo. Thank you so much, Tiffany. Have a nice rest of the day, and we can stay with a little bit of hope, I think.
Yeah.
Muchas gracias, everyone. Thank you. And feel free to reach out to me about anything else. I'm very, very happy to